His lawyer paused, just for a moment, long enough to say, "Julian, you should read the addendum." Julian Ross didn't even look up. He smiled, tapped the pen against the paper, and said, "It's fine. Let's get this over with." The pen moved. And in that single motion, Julian signed away something far more valuable than he realized. Across the table, I lowered my eyes and said nothing. I had learned the hard way that the most dangerous thing you can do in a divorce isn't fighting back. It's letting the other person believe you've already lost. My name is Naomi Carter, and the man who just took everything in our divorce had no idea he'd just agreed to pay for all of it. His lawyer paused. It wasn't dramatic, no raised voice, no warning bells, just a subtle hesitation that most people wouldn't have noticed. "Julian," he said quietly, "you should read the addendum." Julian Ross smiled without looking up. He tapped his pen once against the paper and shook his head. "It's fine," he said. "Let's get this over with." The pen moved, and with that single signature, Julian agreed to something he didn't yet understand. Across the table, I kept my eyes lowered. My hands were folded neatly in my lap, perfectly still. Anyone watching would have seen a woman who looked resigned, defeated even. They would have been wrong. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 36 years old, and until recently, I was married to Julian Ross for 13 years. We lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, the kind of place where success is measured by square footage, car brands, and how confidently someone talks about their next big move. Julian fit in effortlessly. He was charismatic, ambitious, and always convinced he was one deal away from something bigger. I met him when I was 22. I was an accountant then, careful, precise, good with details. Julian liked to tease me about it. He said I thought too much, worried too much. "You can't build anything if you're afraid of risk," he used to say. At the time, I believed him. When Julian decided to start his construction company, he asked me to leave my firm and help him. He said it would only be temporary just until things stabilized. They never did. On paper, I was just his wife. In reality, I ran the back end of the business. Payroll, budgets, vendor payments, tax filings, the unglamorous work that keeps everything standing while someone else takes the credit. Julian loved the front-facing parts, the meetings, the pitches, the praise. He talked about growth like it was proof of intelligence. Debt to him was just a tool. For a long time, the illusion held. We bought a large house, traded up cars, took vacations that looked effortless online. Friends told me how lucky I was, how proud I should be of my husband. What they didn't see were the late payments, the juggling, the constant reshuffling of money to keep everything afloat. I saw it. I always saw it. The moment that changed everything came 2 years before the divorce. I was reviewing accounts late one night when I noticed a loan I didn't recognize. It wasn't huge, but it hadn't gone through me, and that alone was unusual. I traced it back, then forward. There was another and another. Julian had been borrowing quietly, against the house, against future contracts, against revenue that didn't yet exist. When I asked him about it carefully, he laughed. "This is how real businesses grow," he said. "You don't understand scale." I didn't argue. But that night, I stayed up late and ran the numbers myself. What I found wasn't growth. It was exposure. The house wasn't as secure as it looked. The company wasn't profitable. It was leveraged. Everything depended on cash flow continuing exactly as Julian imagined it would. One misstep and the whole thing would collapse. I didn't confront him again. I didn't warn him. Instead, I protected myself. I kept my retirement account separate. I made sure my name wasn't added to new liabilities. I documented everything quietly, methodically, and waited. Julian asked for the divorce 6 months later. There was no argument, no fight. He delivered it the way he delivered everything, cleanly, confidently. "I'm not happy," he said. "I think we both deserve a fresh start." He told me he would keep the house and the business. He offered me a cash settlement that barely covered relocation and a few months of expenses. "I think this is fair," he said, like fairness was something he'd decided on his own. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded. I didn't negotiate. I didn't threaten. I didn't mention the loans or the risk or the fragile structure holding his success together. Julian assumed my silence meant defeat. It didn't occur to him that silence could mean calculation. The mediation process moved quickly. Too quickly for someone who didn't understand what was happening, but perfectly paced for someone who did. Julian wanted everything finalized. No delays, no audits, no complications. His lawyer suggested reviewing the numbers. Julian refused. "I know what my company is worth," he said. "I built it." And now, sitting across from him as he signed the final documents, I understood something with perfect clarity. Julian thought he was taking assets. What he was actually taking was obligation, responsibility. Every debt he'd ignored, every risk he'd dismissed, every shortcut he'd taken, all of it was now his alone. He hadn't won. He just hadn't realized yet what the victory would cost him. And when he finally did, it would already be too late. By the time the paperwork was officially filed, Julian had already rewritten the story in his head. To him, the divorce wasn't a failure. It was a strategic move, a clean cut, something he could explain away at dinner parties with a shrug and a confident smile. "Sometimes people grow in different directions," he told friends. "Naomi just isn't built for this kind of life." That part stung less than it should have, because it was true, just not in the way he meant. I wasn't built for pretending. The shift in our home happened quickly. Julian moved my things into the guest room under the guise of making space. He talked about selling furniture, changing decor, turning the house into something that reflected his new phase. Within 2 weeks, he brought her around. Her name was Lila Moore. She worked in sales for one of Julian's suppliers. Younger, polished, confident in the way people are when they've only seen the highlight reel. She walked into the house like it was already hers, smiled politely, asked where things were. Julian watched her closely, eager to please. I watched quietly. The financial pressure increased as the divorce moved forward. Julian canceled my access to shared accounts to keep things clean. He suggested I start looking for a smaller place. "I'll transfer the settlement once everything's final," he said, as if that should reassure me. What he didn't know was that my future didn't depend on his timeline. Around that time, his mother started calling. Helen Ross had always been polite but distant, the kind of woman who believed success was proof of character and failure was contagious. She offered advice disguised as concern. "You should have supported him more," she said once. "Men like Julian carry a lot of pressure." I let her talk. People reveal more than they intend to when they believe they're speaking to someone who has already lost. The worst betrayal, though, came from someone I didn't expect. Emily Parker, my closest friend since college. She checked in constantly, asked how I was holding up, offered wine, sympathy, reassurance. At first I was grateful. Then Julian started knowing things he shouldn't have known. Conversations I'd had with Emily, thoughts I hadn't shared with anyone else, plans I hadn't finalized. The realization didn't hit all at once. It settled slowly, heavily, until there was no denying it. Emily wasn't just listening. She was reporting. Whether she hoped Julian would choose her later or simply enjoyed feeling relevant didn't matter. She had decided proximity to power was worth more than loyalty. I didn't confront her. Confrontation alerts people. It makes them cautious. Instead, I became careful. I told her less, gave her harmless details, let her pass them along. Julian relaxed. He stopped guarding his words around me, stopped pretending. That was when the arrogance set in. He began to rush the process, pushed for faster mediation dates, refused suggestions of audits or extended reviews. "Dragging this out only costs money," he told his lawyer. "I know what I'm doing." Lila encouraged him. She wanted the house finalized, wanted stability, wanted the lifestyle she'd stepped into to feel permanent. Impatience is expensive. Julian started spending like the future was guaranteed. New watch, upgraded car lease, weekend trips he charged to the business account without hesitation. At the same time, he complained to me about expenses. "You don't realize how tight things are," he said once. "I'm taking all the risk here." I nodded. Risk is invisible to people who think it only applies to others. Behind the scenes, I finalized my own protections. My retirement account stayed untouched. I confirmed that my name wasn't tied to new liabilities. I organized every document I might need, not to fight him, to let him win. That was the part no one understood. Not Emily, not Helen, not even my own lawyer at first. Everyone assumed I was overwhelmed, that I didn't have the energy to contest Julian's demands. They mistook restraint for weakness. Julian's lawyer, to his credit, tried again. He recommended a full financial review before the final agreement, warned Julian politely that signing without verification carried risk. Julian dismissed it. "I built this," he said. "I know exactly what it's worth." The waiver was signed. The trap closed. At mediation, I asked for very little, a modest settlement, my personal belongings, no claim to the house or the company. Julian accepted immediately. He looked at me with something close to pity. "She's being reasonable," he told the mediator. "I appreciate that." What he didn't realize was that reason had nothing to do with it. I wasn't being reasonable. I was being precise. Because the moment Julian insisted on taking everything, he stopped asking the one question that mattered. Not how much is this worth, but what does it cost to keep? And by the time that question caught up with him, the answer would already be signed in ink. The truth is, I didn't decide to wait out of patience. I decided to wait because I understood timing. Julian had always believed intelligence was loud. That confidence meant speaking first, pushing hardest, closing fastest. He mistook speed for strength. I knew better. The night I fully understood how fragile his world was came long before Lila, before lawyers, before mediation. It was late, past midnight. The house was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner and the soft glow of my laptop on the dining table. Julian was out, another client dinner, another promise he'd be home late. I was reconciling the company accounts the way I always did, methodically, without emotion. That was when I noticed the pattern. At first, it was small. Transfers just below thresholds that would normally require discussion. Interest payments routed through secondary accounts. Short-term loans rolled forward instead of paid down. Nothing illegal. Everything dangerous. I traced the activity backward, then forward, following the money the way only someone trained to do so can. By the time the clock read 2:18 a.m., my hands were cold. The house wasn't safe. It had been refinanced more than once, quietly. Equity pulled out to cover cash flow gaps. The kind of decision that makes sense only if you believe tomorrow will always be better than today. The business was worse. Lines of credit were maxed. Vendors were being paid late, then reassured with promises. Taxes had been deferred, legally for now, but the bill was growing. Julian wasn't managing risk. He was stacking it. I remember closing the laptop and sitting there in the dark, listening to the house settle. Everything looked solid, beautiful, expensive, and hollow. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I thought, confronting Julian would have done nothing. He would have dismissed me, talked circles around the numbers, accused me of being negative or unsupportive. Worse, if he realized I saw the truth, he would have tried to protect himself. And Julian's version of protection always involved shifting responsibility onto someone else. That night, I made a quiet decision. I would not save him. I would save myself. From that point on, I changed nothing on the surface. I still attended events, smiled for photos, let him talk about expansion and growth. But behind the scenes, I drew lines. My retirement account stayed untouched. I made sure my name was not added to new loans or guarantees. I stored copies of everything, digitally, physically, redundantly. Not for revenge, for certainty. Over the next year, Julian grew more reckless. The more he believed in his own momentum, the less careful he became. He stopped asking for my input entirely. He stopped pretending we were partners. When the divorce came, it wasn't sudden to me. It was inevitable. Julian framed it as liberation. "I need someone who believes in my vision," he said. "You're always waiting for the other shoe to drop." He wasn't wrong. I was waiting. What he never asked himself was why. By the time we reached mediation, the structure was already in place. The documents, the disclosures, the liabilities attached to every asset Julian wanted. I reviewed them quietly with my lawyer. She raised an eyebrow, suggested negotiation. I shook my head. "Let him take it," I said. She thought I was afraid. She couldn't see the numbers the way I could. Julian, meanwhile, was triumphant. He talked openly about his future with Lila, about renovations, about expansion once the divorce was finalized. He didn't notice that his lawyer's warnings were becoming sharper, shorter. He didn't notice the addendum, the liability schedule, the fine print, because Julian had never read fine print in his life. The day of the final hearing, as he sat across from me, relaxed and confident, I understood something with perfect clarity. Julian wasn't losing because I outplayed him. He was losing because he had always believed success meant never slowing down long enough to look underneath. I had. And when he signed those papers, he didn't just take the house, the company, the image. He took ownership of every risk he'd ignored. The moment hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. And when it did, there would be no one left for him to blame but himself. The weeks leading up to the final hearing felt strangely quiet, not calm. Quiet in the way air feels before a storm, heavy, pressed down. Everyone around Julian moved faster, talked louder, celebrated earlier than they should have. He mistook that noise for momentum. The house began to change before the divorce was even final. Lila brought over boxes of decor, talked about repainting, replacing furniture, fresh energy. Julian encouraged it. He wanted the space to reflect where he was going, not where he'd been. I moved out quietly. A small apartment across town. Nothing dramatic, nothing temporary either. I chose it carefully. Affordable, manageable, neutral. A place that didn't require pretending. Julian didn't ask where I was going. He didn't need to. In his mind, I was already in the past. He was busy telling his version of the story. She didn't even fight, he said to friends. I offered something fair, she just wanted out. Helen echoed him. At lunches, at church, anywhere sympathy could be converted into validation. She was never strong enough for the pressure Julian carries, she said. Some people aren't built for success. I let them talk. People who believe they've won don't guard their words. Julian's spending escalated. A new watch appeared on his wrist, expensive enough to notice. He justified it as a reward for making it through a difficult chapter. He charged it to the business. At the same time, he complained about costs, told me I was lucky to be getting a settlement at all, suggested I should be grateful he wasn't being difficult. Difficulty to Julian meant resistance. I offered none. Mediation was a performance. Neutral office. Long table. Mediator smiling politely while pretending not to take sides. Julian sat relaxed, confident, occasionally glancing at Lila's messages on his phone. I played my role. Quiet, reserved, cooperative. When my lawyer raised concerns, I asked her to stop. I don't want to drag this out, I said softly. I just want to move on. The mediator nodded approvingly. Julian looked almost relieved. He accepted every term I proposed, because every term favored him. The house, the company, the vehicles, all his. The only hesitation came from his lawyer. He suggested again a financial review, a verification, something, anything to confirm the numbers. Julian refused. I know what I'm signing, he said. Let's not waste time. The waiver was signed. I watched the pen move across the page. That moment didn't feel triumphant. It felt inevitable. The night before the hearing, Julian texted me. Thanks for being reasonable. This didn't have to be ugly. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied, I just want closure, which was true, just not in the way he assumed. The courthouse the next morning was cold and bright. Marble floors, high ceilings, the kind of place that makes everything feel official, permanent. Julian arrived early, smiling, confident. He wore a suit I recognized, one I'd once helped him choose. Lila waited outside the courtroom, scrolling through her phone, already planning the next phase. I arrived alone. Simple dress, minimal makeup, nothing that drew attention. Exactly as expected. The judge reviewed the agreement carefully. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than on Julian. Mrs. Carter, she said, you understand that you're relinquishing claims to significant marital assets? Yes, I said calmly. And you're doing so voluntarily? Yes. She studied my face, searching for hesitation. There was none. Julian barely listened. He was already done with this part. His future was waiting in the hallway. When the documents were passed forward, he signed quickly. Confident strokes, no pauses. I signed last, slowly. When it was over, the judge finalized the agreement. The words echoed in the room. Formal, irreversible. Julian stood first. He smiled at me. Not kindly, not cruelly. Triumphantly, as if I just confirmed everything he believed about himself. Outside the courtroom, his lawyer stopped him, spoke quietly, urgently. Julian's expression shifted, just slightly. I didn't stay to watch. I walked down the steps and into the sunlight, feeling lighter with every step. I knew what was coming. Julian didn't yet. But the moment he opened that addendum, really opened it, the story he'd been telling himself would collapse under its own weight. And by then, there would be nothing left to negotiate. Because the truth doesn't need to argue. It only needs time. Julian didn't open the addendum right away. For a while, life continued exactly as he expected it to. He moved back into the house fully. Lila unpacked her things, rearranged closets, replaced artwork. The place transformed quickly. Less history, more intention. Julian liked that. It made everything feel clean, controlled. He told people the divorce had been easy. She didn't fight, he said more than once. I respected that. Respect, in Julian's world, meant compliance. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. A letter from the bank, then another. Julian assumed it was routine, administrative cleanup after the divorce. He tossed the envelopes onto the counter, unopened, telling himself he'd deal with them later. Later came fast. Within 2 weeks, his business line of credit was frozen. A vendor called, asking about an overdue payment Julian was certain had already been handled. When he checked the account, the balance didn't make sense. Too low, too tight. He blamed timing, cash flow, seasonal lag. Then the mortgage notice arrived. Julian opened that one. He read it once, then again. The number at the bottom didn't match what he thought he owed. It was higher, significantly higher. He pulled the rest of the documents from the folder, the ones he'd signed without reading carefully, the asset schedule, the settlement terms, and finally the addendum, the liability disclosure. Julian sat down at the kitchen table and started reading, slowly, carefully. By the time he reached the second page, his hands were shaking. Every loan, every refinance, every line of credit, all listed, all assigned. Sole responsibility, Julian Ross. The house wasn't just his. Neither was the business. They came bundled with every obligation he'd ever ignored, deferred, or minimized. The realization hit him all at once. He hadn't taken assets. He'd taken debt. Julian called his lawyer immediately. This isn't right, he said, pacing the living room. She hid this from me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I advised you to conduct a financial review, his lawyer said evenly. You declined. But she knew, Julian insisted. She knew and didn't say anything. She wasn't required to, the lawyer replied. The disclosures were attached. You signed. Julian felt something close to panic for the first time in his adult life. He demanded a meeting, threatened to contest the agreement, asked about fraud, misrepresentation, anything that might reopen the case. The answers were calm, unemotional, final. The agreement was valid. The waiver was clear. The risk was his. By the end of the week, Lila noticed the change. Julian stopped spending, stopped talking about future plans. He stayed up late, staring at spreadsheets, muttering under his breath. What's going on? She asked one night. He tried to explain. She didn't like the explanation. This isn't what you told me, she said carefully. You said everything was solid. It is, Julian snapped. It's just temporary. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when numbers don't cooperate. Within a month, Julian was juggling payments, moving money from one account to another the way I once had, except without understanding the consequences. Vendors grew impatient. Banks stopped being polite. Lila grew distant. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She simply began to disengage. One morning, Julian came downstairs to find a note on the counter. I need stability. This isn't it. She was gone. The house felt larger without her, emptier, less forgiving. Julian tried to sell it. The appraisal came back lower than expected, lower than what he owed. There were no offers, only conversations about short sales and restructuring. The business followed soon after. Creditors filed claims. Accounts were audited. Promises Julian had made without thinking became liabilities he couldn't escape. He told people he'd been tricked, that he'd trusted the wrong person, that he'd been too generous. What he didn't say, what he couldn't admit, was that he'd never bothered to look closely at the foundation of his own success. I heard about all of this secondhand. through mutual acquaintances, through whispers. I didn't intervene. I didn't celebrate. I moved on, because the outcome wasn't personal. It was mathematical. Julian had built his life on momentum and assumption. I had built mine on understanding. And in the end, understanding always outlasts confidence. The last time Julian tried to reach me, his message was brief. "We need to talk." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to explain. He had taken everything he wanted. Now he simply had to live with it. The aftermath unfolded without spectacle. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public breakdowns, no moment where Julian openly admitted what he'd done. The collapse happened quietly, the way financial reality usually does, through paperwork, deadlines, and doors that stop opening. Within 2 months of Lila leaving, Julian stopped answering most calls, not because he didn't care, because he didn't know what to say. Every conversation led back to the same questions he no longer had answers for. Payment plans, obligations, timelines. The things he'd always brushed aside as details suddenly became the center of his life. The business limped along, then stalled. A major supplier pulled out. Another demanded immediate settlement. Without fresh credit, Julian couldn't cover payroll and keep projects moving at the same time. He chose projects. Payroll followed. The employees who once praised his vision left quietly, carrying their resumes and their disillusionment with them. The house became a burden instead of a symbol. Mortgage notices stacked up. Maintenance was delayed. Repairs postponed. The place that once hosted dinners and celebrations now echoed with absence. Julian tried to renegotiate, with banks, with lenders, with anyone willing to listen. They listened. They just didn't bend. Contracts, unlike people, don't care about intention. I learned all of this indirectly, through the same channels that once delivered Julian's confidence and charm. The tone had changed. Where there had been admiration, there was now distance. Where there had been praise, there was silence. Success, I realized, is often rented. Failure reveals who owns nothing at all. Around this time, Julian's mother reached out. Helen's message was polite, careful. She said she hadn't known how bad things were, that she regretted how she'd spoken to me, that she hoped we could talk. I read the message twice. Then I deleted it. Some apologies arrived too late to matter. I was busy building something else. My apartment had stopped feeling temporary. I replaced the couch, hung artwork, painted the walls a color that felt intentional instead of cautious. I returned to consulting work part-time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I chose clients, set boundaries, charged appropriately. For the first time in years, my decisions weren't filtered through someone else's ego. Julian tried again. This time, he showed up unannounced. I recognized his car before I heard the knock. He looked thinner, tired. The confidence that once filled rooms now barely filled his posture. "I didn't know," he said immediately. "I swear I didn't." I leaned against the doorframe and waited. "I made mistakes," he continued. "I trusted the wrong people. I moved too fast." He was still telling the story as if someone else had pushed him. "I need help," he said finally. There it was, the truth, stripped of performance. I felt something then, not satisfaction, not anger, distance. "You asked for everything," I said calmly. "You got it." He looked at me like he wanted to argue, then like he wanted to plead. "I thought you were giving up," he said quietly. "I wasn't," I replied. "I was stepping aside." We stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then I closed the door. That night, I slept deeply. Not because Julian was suffering, but because I wasn't responsible for carrying his choices anymore. The world didn't punish him. It simply stopped protecting him. And that, I'd learned, is the difference between loss and consequence. By letting Julian take everything, I had finally given myself the one thing I'd been missing all along: freedom. After Julian stopped trying to reach me, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Not excitement, not victory, stability. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply exists. Mornings became quieter. I woke up without bracing myself for bad news or unfinished arguments. I drank my coffee slowly. I worked without interruption. I made plans without calculating how someone else might react. For years, my life had been organized around managing uncertainty. Now, uncertainty belonged to someone else. Julian's name still surfaced occasionally, usually in the form of secondhand updates. A mutual acquaintance mentioning that his company was being dissolved. Someone else noting that the house was officially listed for a short sale. Always said with lowered voices, as if failure were contagious. I listened without comment. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly people distanced themselves from Julian, but how quickly they rewrote their memories of him. He was always reckless, one person said. I never trusted the way he ran things, said another. The same people who once applauded his confidence now framed it as arrogance. Success forgives many flaws. Failure forgives none. I didn't correct them. Everyone edits the past to protect themselves. The only person who truly changed was me. I stopped explaining my decisions, stopped softening my language to make others comfortable. When people asked how I was doing, I didn't minimize or deflect. I'm doing well, I said, and meant it. Work expanded naturally. Former colleagues reached out. One small consulting project turned into 3. I chose the ones that interested me, declined the rest. Saying no felt like a skill I was learning late, but quickly. One afternoon, my lawyer called to inform me that all remaining matters tied to the divorce were officially closed. No further claims, no loose ends. Clean break, she said. After the call, I sat in silence for a while. I expected relief. What I felt instead was clarity. Julian hadn't ruined my life. He'd revealed it. I saw now how much energy I'd spent cushioning his choices, anticipating fallout, translating risk into reassurance, protecting him from consequences he didn't want to face. Without that role, I was lighter. That evening, I ran into Emily, the friend who'd betrayed my trust, by chance. A grocery store aisle, an awkward pause. She looked nervous, apologetic. I heard things didn't work out for him, she said carefully. No, I replied. They worked out exactly as they were built. She didn't know what to say to that. Neither did I feel the need to explain. We exchanged polite goodbyes and walked away in opposite directions. The moment passed without wait. That's how you know something no longer owns you. The final update about Julian came months later. He'd moved again, downsized further. The business was officially gone. Bankruptcy proceedings were underway. No dramatic ending, just reality closing in. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. One night, sitting alone in my apartment, I thought about the woman I had been when I first met Julian. Young, careful, willing to trust confidence over substance. She hadn't been foolish. She'd been untested. Life tests you whether you volunteer or not. Julian believed strength meant momentum, never stopping long enough to question direction. I had learned that strength can also mean restraint. Waiting, letting someone walk exactly where they insist on going. By giving Julian what he wanted, I had refused to carry what he didn't want to see. That choice changed everything. The story people told was simple. He took everything, and it collapsed. The truth was quieter. He took responsibility without understanding it. And I finally stopped absorbing consequences that were never mine to begin with. When I turned off the lights that night, the apartment felt peaceful. Not empty, not lonely. Complete. For the first time since the divorce, I didn't think about what came next. I trusted that whatever it was, I would meet it without fear, because I had already survived the moment that once terrified me most, and I had done it by stepping aside and letting the truth take its time. Time did what confrontation never could. It settled things, not all at once, and not loudly, but with a steady certainty that couldn't be argued with. By the time a full year had passed, Julian's name no longer carried tension for me. It surfaced occasionally, like an old headline you barely register, already knowing how the story ends. What surprised me was how much space opened up once that tension was gone. I started noticing small things again. The way morning light moved across the floor of my apartment. How quiet felt different from loneliness. How decisions were easier when they belonged to me alone. Work became more than a distraction. It became grounding. Clients trusted me because I didn't sell optimism. I sold clarity. I asked uncomfortable questions. I insisted on numbers that made sense, timelines that were real, structures that could withstand pressure. More than once, a client said, You're the first person who didn't just tell me what I wanted to hear. I took that as a compliment. I knew exactly where telling people what they wanted to hear could lead. One afternoon, I was reviewing documents for a small construction firm, ironically similar to Julian's old business, when the owner admitted something mid-conversation. "I've been pushing growth faster than we can support," he said. "Everyone tells me it'll work out." I closed the folder and looked at him. "Growth isn't the problem," I said. "Ignoring the cost of it is." He listened. That was the difference. Julian had never listened. He'd confused agreement with intelligence, applause with validation. And when those things disappeared, there was nothing left to hold the structure together. I heard that the house finally sold, but not in the way Julian had once imagined. A short sale, months of negotiation, credit damage that would follow him for years. The person who told me sounded almost apologetic. "I thought you'd want to know," she said. "I already did," I replied. "Not the details, but the outcome. Consequences follow patterns. Once you understand them, surprises disappear." Late that summer, Julian sent one final message. Not a plea, not an apology, just a sentence. "I didn't know how much you were carrying." I stared at it for a long time. He was closer to the truth than he realized, but still not there. I never replied. Some realizations don't require acknowledgement. They arrive too late to change anything. What mattered was what came next. I stopped defining my life by what I'd escaped. I stopped using the divorce as a reference point. Before Julian, after Julian. Those divisions blurred until they no longer mattered. I redecorated my apartment, not to erase the past, but to reflect the present. Fewer distractions, cleaner lines, practical beauty, a space designed to last. One evening, as I stood in the quiet, I thought about how easily things could have gone differently. How tempting it would have been to fight, to argue, to prove I was right. That path would have cost me time, money, and peace. Instead, I'd chosen restraint. Not because I was weak, because I understood leverage. Julian had believed leverage came from control. I knew it came from clarity. The irony wasn't lost on me. The person everyone assumed had lost everything was the only one who walked away unburdened. No debt, no resentment, no unfinished business. Julian took what he demanded. I kept what mattered. And as the year drew to a close, I realized something quietly profound. The story wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about refusal. Refusing to absorb responsibility for someone else's denial. Refusing to sacrifice my future to protect another person's illusion. Refusing to fight a battle that didn't need fighting. Letting go isn't passive. Sometimes, it's the most deliberate act there is. When I turned off the lights that night and lay in bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Confidence without performance. Security without excess. Peace without explanation. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. The kind that lasts. The real ending didn't arrive with a phone call or a headline. It arrived quietly on an ordinary afternoon in the middle of an ordinary week. I was reviewing a set of contracts when an email notification appeared at the corner of my screen. A familiar law firm name, not mine, his, Julian's. The message was brief, formal, carefully worded. It informed me that all remaining matters related to the dissolution of Ross Construction LLC had been finalized. No further obligations, no outstanding claims involving me. That was it. No drama, no apology, no attempt to rewrite the past. Just confirmation. I leaned back in my chair and let the moment pass without ceremony. For a long time, I'd imagined this would feel heavier, more meaningful, that I'd need to sit with it, process it, mark it somehow. Instead, it felt like closing a file I'd finished reading months ago. Julian was officially done, not just with the business, with the version of himself that had depended on momentum instead of truth. People still talked, of course. They always do. But the tone had changed again. Where there had once been whispers, there was now distance. Julian's story had become a cautionary one, something people referenced vaguely, without details, as if proximity to it might still carry risk. I heard he expanded too fast. I heard he ignored warnings. I heard he didn't listen to the numbers. All true, all incomplete. What no one ever mentioned was the choice he'd been given, the moment he could have slowed down, verified, reconsidered. He hadn't taken it. That wasn't my failure. It was his habit. Around that time, I was invited to speak at a small professional workshop. Nothing prestigious, just a room of business owners and consultants looking to learn from each other's mistakes. Someone asked me what the biggest risk factor was in growing a company. I didn't hesitate. Refusing to look closely at what's holding it up, I said. Heads nodded. Pens moved. They understood. Julian never had. Later that evening, I ran into Helen, his mother, by chance. A bookstore cafe, an awkward moment where neither of us could pretend not to see the other. She looked older, not dramatically so, just tired in a way that suggested disappointment had settled in permanently. I didn't realize, she said after a pause, how bad it was. I met her eyes. You didn't want to, I replied. She flinched, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. We exchanged polite goodbyes, nothing more. That was all the closure either of us needed. The most meaningful shift, though, happened internally. I stopped replaying conversations, stopped wondering if I could have said something differently, stopped imagining alternative endings. The past became informational, not emotional, a reference point, not a wound. One night, as I was organizing old documents, I came across an early business plan Julian had written years ago. Bold projections, confident language, assumptions stacked on assumptions. I read it without bitterness. Only clarity. Julian hadn't failed because he lacked intelligence or opportunity. He failed because he believed belief itself was enough. I recycled the papers and moved on. The following morning, I woke up with a strange sense of lightness. Not happiness, something steadier. Trust, not in other people, in myself. I trusted my instincts again, trusted my ability to see what others missed, trusted my restraint. That trust had cost me a marriage. It had given me a future. When people ask me now how I'd gotten through the divorce so calmly, I didn't offer strategies or slogans. I told the truth. I didn't rush, I said. I paid attention. Most people nodded politely and moved on. A few understood. Those were the ones who stayed. As the year drew to a close, I realized there was nothing left to resolve. No loose ends, no lingering anger, no unfinished conversations. Julian's story had ended the way it was always going to end. Mine had simply continued. Not louder, not richer, not more impressive, just clearer. And that clarity, earned slowly, quietly, without witnesses, was worth more than anything he had ever taken. By choosing not to fight for what looked valuable, I had kept what actually was. And that, I finally understood, was the only victory that lasts. The last thing I expected was gratitude. Not from Julian, not from anyone connected to him. From myself. It came one quiet morning as I stood at the window of my apartment, coffee cooling in my hands, watching the city wake up. Traffic moved. People hurried. Somewhere, someone was already making a decision they didn't fully understand. I felt no urgency to join them. For years, my life had been shaped by reacting, adjusting to Julian's pace, smoothing over risks, absorbing consequences that weren't mine to carry. I had mistaken that adaptability for strength. It wasn't. Strength, I learned, is choosing when not to move. My work had settled into something sustainable, not explosive, not impressive to strangers, but solid, predictable in the best way. Clients trusted me because I didn't rush them. I asked them to slow down, to read the fine print, to understand the weight of what they were signing. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes they didn't. I'd stopped needing to convince anyone. One afternoon, months after everything had fully closed, Julian called again. I almost didn't answer, but I did. "I won't take much of your time," he said. His voice was calm, stripped of confidence, stripped of performance. "I just wanted to say, you were right." I waited. "I thought winning meant taking," he continued. I didn't understand that keeping things running was the real work. There was no self-pity in his tone this time, just recognition. "I don't expect anything from you," he added. I just needed to say it. I thanked him. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because I didn't need distance anymore. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief or closure. I felt neutral. And neutrality, I realized, is freedom. That evening, I went through my old files one last time. Statements, agreements, notes from a life that no longer belonged to me. I didn't linger. I shredded what didn't need keeping and archived what mattered. The rest went into recycling, numbers and assumptions dissolving into pulp. Julian had once told me I was afraid of losing. He'd been wrong. I was afraid of carrying what wasn't mine. And when I stopped doing that, everything changed. The story people would tell, if they told it at all, would be simple. He took everything. It fell apart. But that wasn't the lesson. The lesson was quieter. He took responsibility without understanding it. I stepped aside because I did. There was no revenge in that, no clever trick, no dramatic reveal. Just a refusal to protect someone from the cost of their own choices. That night, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I thought about the addendum Julian had ignored. The one that changed everything. The fine print. Most people skim it. Some people never read it. But it's always there, waiting. In contracts, in relationships, in life. I slept easily, knowing I would never again sign anything I didn't understand, or let someone else decide what I was willing to carry. Julian had taken what looked like everything. I had kept what was real, my judgment, my patience, my future. And as the city outside my window settled into darkness, I understood something with absolute certainty. Walking away isn't losing. Not when you know exactly what you're leaving behind. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone have what they insist on, and trust that the truth will finish the rest.